Hello viewers, welcome once again to our ongoing series entitled Mendelism and Beyond. Today we are beginning with a totally new chapter which comes under your genetics and cytogenetics unit, which is entitled Unit 4, and that is fine structure of gene interaction, population and evolutionary genetics. It's a very long topic and we will pick up 6 or 7 of the subunits from it, which would mean the genetics of sex determination, a study of sex chromosomes, the structure of X and Y chromosomes, and then we would dwell upon what are the different patterns of sex determination in animals, what are the different types of genetical and environmental controls which are governing the sex determination process. Thereafter, we will talk about the patterns of sex determination in plants, because viewers, you should remember that there is a proper sex determination machinery even in plants. And then we will take on to sex-linked inheritance, which means there are various genes which are linked to the X chromosome, and of course the genes which are linked to the Y chromosomes, which are called as the Hollandric genes. Thereafter, we would spend much time on various characters which are sex-influenced and also sex-limited. And at the end, one would talk about the dosage compensation, the hyperactivity of the X chromosome, and how are the X and the Y chromosomes different. Once we begin with the study of the genetics of sexual reproduction, one should first remember what are the various modes of sexual reproduction that are available to different organisms. Viewers, that there is a very wide range of reproductive modes in the life cycles which are observed all over the biological world. There are so many organisms which are in fact not showing any evidence of sexual reproduction at all, and their life goes in an entirely asexual means of reproduction. There are so many bacteria which are only showing binary fission and some very lower forms. On the other hand, there are some organisms which will alternate between very short periods of sexual reproduction, and then they would have prolonged periods of asexual reproduction. But then, as a rule, we find that in diploid eukaryotes, sexual reproduction is perhaps the only natural mechanism where the members of the species are produced, although they may have from time to time asexual reproduction and vegetative propagation. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that if sexual reproduction has to take place, there must be an orderly transmission of genetic material from the parents to the offspring. It would mean that how would we ensure this orderly transmission? It would be on account of segregation and independent assortment, which would take place during meiosis, and then it would ensure that results in phenotypic variability. You remember, viewers, we have had very long sessions on the Mendelian genetics, wherein we had talked in details about the independent assortment and the genetic ratios and the segregation ratios, and there was a well-defined mathematical progression of the transmission of each of the characters, whether they were alone or whether they were in combination. various characters were even linked, and therefore we had talked in details about the segregation processes. But then, to ensure that all the events must now run successfully, the first prerequisite would be that at least there is an efficient union of gametes at the time of fertilization. So unless this happens, how can the sexually reproducing organisms have a proper lineage or a proper offspring production? So that means this particular property of successful fertilization definitely depends on some special type of sexual differentiation which would happen or which would occur in the reproductive organisms. Now the point is, you may not always see how this differentiation is occurring. That means it may not be externally visible always in various organisms. Say for example, how would you know that a bacterium is male or a female, members of archaea, or how would you know a unicellular eukaryote, say such as algae for example, Chlamydomonas, that it is a male or a female? So these are the units of relative sexuality which you must have read in your other lectures on algae. But then here they are yet different. What do we mean by yet different? They may morphologically appear the same, but they would belong to different mating types. So that means the differentiation is not externally visible, but it would definitely be there in terms of its metabolism, in terms of its genetics. So that means if we talk about a comparison with humans, then we find that the differentiation of sexes is much more evident in the form of what is called as phenotypic dimorphism. That means the males and the females are different. How are they different? Morphologically, anatomically, behavior wise, hormone wise, and other parameters taken into account. Before we talk about the different mechanisms, let us talk something about the terminology. As you can see on your screens, we generally designate the maleness and femaleness of any organism by certain symbols, and these are the ancient Greek symbols. As you can see on your screens, the green one is of a male, and the female is on the right hand side, which is colored red, and they even have a connotation or a connection with the planets. The ancient Greek symbols for maleness have been designated from iron and Mars. So a male designation would be in the form of a shield and spear, which would be an old Greek signal. Why do we put an shield and a spear? Because it is made up of iron, it is believed, and forged for weaponry, and it corresponds to Mars, which is the Greek god of war, and it is the emblem of masculinity. And as a planet, it is very ruddy, which means it has a reddish color in the night sky. So this is how the Greek emblem for maleness stays. On the other hand, the ancient Greek symbol for femaleness, as you can see on your screens, has been derived from softer metal, that is copper, and it was believed that it is a symbol for Venus, that is for Aphrodite, which is who's the goddess of love, and it is depicted by a mirror, because mirror is considered to be a figure of femininity, and the Venus glows greenish just after sunrise, and this has come to symbolize the femaleness. So wherever we are using these two symbols, they have been derived from the Greek terminology. And therefore, we would conclude that almost all species are often divided into two sections, and that is according to the gamete or the sex cells produced, they would be male or female. For your information, viewers, the word sex itself has been derived from the Latin word sexus, which means separation. So that means the segregation of these two types has already been there. But it is very surprising and interesting also that we in the living world are not only constricted to just two sexes, namely male and the female. Some of the lower plants or the lowest forms of plant and animal life for that matter, they are supposed to have many sexes. Let us take an example of one variety of a ciliated protozoan, which is Paramecium bursaria. Imagine it has 8 sexes. Now we will call these sexes as mating types, because we cannot morphologically distinguish any of them. As I said before, they are morphologically identical, but their behavior is entirely unique. So what happens is that each of the mating type, each of the 8 mating types is not in a position to conjugate with its own type. Say if we designate it as 1, so 1 is never going to conjugate with another one. It may conjugate from 2 to 8, any of it. So it may exchange the genetic material with any of the other remaining 7 types of the same variety. So this is the most primitive type of sexual reproduction that one can conceive of, where there is no apparent distinction at all between the sexes, and yet the genetic exchange or the exchange of genetic material is going on. So that means if, for example, an animal that would possess both the male and female reproductive organs would be usually called as a hermaphrodite. Right now we are dwelling on some of the important terms which are used, but then it would be a term which we can restrict to animals and even to human beings. But then when it comes to plants, the term hermaphrodite is not very feasible, and we will prefer another term which is called as monoecious. Why do we do that? Because there are staminate plants, that means having the male sex organs, and the female ones which are the pistillate ones. So that means any plant having both of these would be better called as a monoecious one. Viewers, that we have perfect flowers also, where male and female parts are present in the same flower, but then there are a whole lot of variations. Why? Because there are organisms, there are plants where both male and female gametes are produced by different individuals. That means the male and the female flowers may be present on different plants. In that case, we would like to call them as dioecious. So very few of the angiosperms are dioecious. Most of them are monoecious. However, there are several exceptions. For example, asparagus, date palm, hemp, which is cannabis, and hops, which is humulus, carica papaya, spinacia, kiwi fruit, and willow, which is salix. On your screens, you would find a list of the dioecious angiosperms along with their botanical names, which start from asparagus, then the cloudberry, which is very important rubus species, and date palm, which is Phoenix dictylifera spinach, willow, as I said, a yam, which is Dioscorea, and hops, which is Humulus, the kiwi fruit, mistletoe, carica papaya, and the poplars, the poplar trees, that is Populus. So there are very few among the angiosperms which are really dioecious. However, we have a very long type of list as far as the phenotypes are concerned, and mind you, they are sex phenotypes because there are so many permutations and combinations. A normal hermaphrodite in a plant would be where we have all the perfect flowers, that is male and female sex organs in one. A monoecious, as I said, would be separate female and the male flowers, but they are residing on the same plant. Viewers, if you have read about pollination, then you have so many terms like autogamy, geitonogamy, xenogamy, and so on. Dioecious plants would have separate female and male flowers, but again on different plants. And then comes some complication. Andromonoecious. Now this is a combination. You have perfect flower and a male flower on the same plant. So that means this is a corollary of a monoecious plant. But then one of the flowers is perfect. However, both the sexes are present. Gynomonoecious similarly has a perfect and a female one on the same plant. Then you have a trimonoecious, which is a combination of all perfect, female and a male flower on the same plant. And then you have the androdioecious, where you have perfect and male flowers on separate plants. And finally, the gynandrodioecious or gynodinoecious, perfect and the female flowers on the same plant. So that means these are all the primary sexual characters that we are talking about. What about the other characters which are in addition to the sex cells and the reproductive organs? They are called as the secondary sexual characters. Now the secondary sexual characters are basically the somatic characters and not the reproductive ones. And this brings us to a very important terminology, and that is, if we have the difference between the organisms in terms of their morphological, physiological, behavioral and molecular differentiation, and then we can designate them as male and female sexes, the phenomenon would be called as sexual dimorphism. Now on your screens you can see a good definition of sexual dimorphism, which means that the two sexes of the same species will have different characteristics. It's not only the sex organs which are different, the other differences, namely the somatic ones, are also present. And the word or the term dimorphism is derived again from the Greek dimorphos, which means two different forms. Now the microbes may not show dimorphism, but then various plants and animals they would show, at least during some time of their life cycle, this type of a phenomenon if they are reproducing sexually. So that means the males also are, and the females in case of the human beings would also follow this pattern. You can find that the two gametes may even be different or largely different in size, because the motile small sperms are present, and in sharp contrast the females, which are going to give rise to eggs, are having very large structures, because the nutrients have to be there and a new generation has to be hibernated there. So if we look at a very nice pictorial of sexual dimorphism on your screens, it means a difference has been highlighted between a spermatozoid and an ovum. So there's absolutely no comparison as far as the size of these two gametes is concerned. Of course, their size is different, their composition is different, and the function, of course, is also different. The sexual dimorphism would include differences in size, as I said before, weight, color, and markings. Now, many animals are showing these type of differences which highlight the sexual dimorphism. Sometimes these differences are very subtle, but in some cases they are even exaggerated, and they are highlighted in terms of their utility. As we would see on the screens, a picture which shows you the different types of examples. In animals, the classical example is of a lion and a lioness, a peacock and a peahen, and the male and the female deer. And among plants, the classical examples being the male and the female papaya plants and the male and the female hemp plants, that is the cannabis plants. Actually, this idea of sexual dimorphism was also given a clear understanding by the work of Darwin, because the Darwin's theory of sexual selection was influenced by the fact that he said that the idea of sexual dimorphism influences greatly the sexual selection. Now, what does it mean? It means that most of the sexual dimorphism was due to the sexual selection process. This was the idea of Darwin, and that is, it had some utility. On your screens, if you find a diagram, once again a picture of a beautiful looking and a very attractive peacock, a male. So that means the female might choose to mate with a highly ornamented male rather than a very ordinary looking one. So that means this is a case of sexual selection, which ultimately would lead to sexual dimorphism. Even otherwise, you would find that the other utility would be that the male deer, for example, they would have certain characteristics in the form of very large body size, having antlers which are used for defense as well as offense, and by virtue of these characteristics, the males are able to attract the females for their progeny. Similar type of examples can be cited with elephants, chimpanzees, gorillas, and even wild boars. So that means you would find that sometimes dimorphism is occurring in such a manner that within a same species you would find that there is a difference between the males and the females. The example of parakeets on your screen is a very interesting one. You can find the male and the female parakeets. Their body color is different, but then please concentrate on the color of the beak, which is called as the wax in this case. Now, actually the sexual dimorphism is that specific area which is called as the wax, that is on their beaks. If they have a more brown color and a rough color, they would be designated as the female ones. And if you sometimes find that the wax of a female is painted as blue, then it would be attacked by the males, because blue is the characteristic of males. And if the wax of the male is painted brown, the males would think that it is a female, and they would start courting this particular individual as a female. So it's a very interesting aspect how the color and the texture of the beak can attract a member of an opposite sex. Another example is seen in terms of toads. Here there is an immense difference in the size of the forearms. You know that the male toads, they tend to hug the females during copulation. So naturally they should have a stronger and a more developed arms, and they could also have spines on their hands to hold the female better. On your screens you can find a copulating pair of toads, and the size of the female is definitely much larger than the males. Likewise, we have the female raptors, eagles, owls, hawks. The females are much larger. There is a reason to it, because the females, they have to spend much more time in the nest incubating the eggs. If they are of a larger size, they would defend the nest better. And these females are normally more aggressive and more territorial than the males. So in this case, the size really helps. In the arthropods, we find that the females again tend to be much larger, as you can see in Drosophila, in praying mantis, the flies and mosquitoes. The same would be probably true for amphibians and reptiles. On your screens you would find the wonder material Drosophila melanogaster, which is the common fruit fly, and there is a distinct difference between the size. The males are shorter, they are smaller, whereas the females are much larger. So that means sexual dimorphism may be of advantage, but then in some cases we find that it may have a disadvantage also, because if an animal is having a brighter color or a more striking appearance, it would naturally be more exposed to the predators. This also happens in certain cases. And in our next lecture, we would continue with the idea of sexual dimorphism, and then would gradually go to the different genic mechanisms for sex determination, as to what are the various ways in which the sex of the organisms is determined, and which ultimately leads to sexual dimorphism. Thank you.